You know that feeling when you want to really get something complex, to cut through the noise and understand what it means for the future? That's exactly what we're digging into today.
Indeed. We're taking a deep dive into a piece of legislation with the pretty unassuming name of the Congressional Review Act, the CRA.
The CRA, right.
What makes it so interesting, I think, is its potential to dramatically reshape the regulatory landscape, especially if, we see a second Trump administration looking at Biden-era rules.
Okay, the CRA. We've got a fair bit of information here. Legal breakdowns, some news analysis from places like Fox News, Marketplace.
Right.
And perspectives from think tanks, too, like the Heritage Foundation and the Regulatory Studies Center.
A good mix.
So our goal, our mission for this deep dive, to really understand the nuts and bolts of the CRA, how it works, how it might be used.
And which regulations could be in the crosshairs, particularly, things like consumer finance, environmental rules. Those seem like key areas.
Definitely. So to lay the groundwork, let's start right at the beginning.
Yeah.
What is the Congressional Review Act?
Okay. Fundamentally, this law came onto the books back in 1996.
96, okay.
And at its core, it's basically a mechanism for Congress to, undo regulations, specifically regulations issued by a previous administration.
And it's not like they need a supermajority or anything complicated.
No, that's the key part. It just takes a simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate, and then the president has to sign it.
Got it. So simple majority plus the president.
But what's really strategic about the CRA, the scenario it's kind of designed for, it really becomes a powerful tool when you have a switch in the White House. And crucially, the new president's party also controls both chambers of Congress.
Okay, so you need that particular alignment. The White House flip and control of Congress.
Exactly. That's what unlocks its potential for, streamlining the rollback of these regulations.
It sounds like a tool that could be, a real game changer or just sit on the shelf. Was it used a lot right after 96?
Not really, no. Initially, it was pretty sparingly used, but it really came into its own, you could say, during the 115th Congress.
That was Trump's first term.
Right. President Trump's first term. They used the CRA to overturn, get this, 16 regulations from the Obama administration.
16? Wow.
Yeah, that's when people really started paying attention to it as a serious policy lever.
16 regulations. That's quite a few. Now, I remember reading something about a look-back window. What's that about?
The look-back window. Yeah, that's a sort of clever feature of the Act. It basically lets the new Congress target regulations that were finalized right near the end of the previous administration.
So like a lame duck period rush.
Exactly. It's meant to stop an outgoing administration from pushing through a bunch of rules in its final months that the incoming team might, strongly disagree with.
And how far back does that window typically go?
Well, based on past practice, it usually stretches back to around August of the year before the presidential election.
Okay, so if we're talking about a potential administration starting in 2025, we'd be looking at Biden-era regulations finalized roughly from August 2024 onwards. Those would be the vulnerable ones.
That's the general time frame, yeah. And current estimates, they vary, but some suggest as many as 1,300 Biden administration rules could technically fall into that window and be targeted.
Whoa, 1,300. That seems huge.
It does, but realistically, only about 100 of those are probably considered significant enough, major enough, to likely attract the political effort needed to actually use the CRA.
Okay, 100 is still a lot, but it's not 1,300. Are there practical limits on how many they can actually tackle? It can't just be open season?
Oh, absolutely. Practical limits are key. Each regulation has to be handled individually by Congress. One by one. They can't just bundle them up and say, disapprove all these. They need a separate resolution, a separate vote for each one.
Okay, that makes sense.
And given how much time Congress has and all the other things they need to do.
Right, legislation, budget.
Exactly. It really limits the number they can realistically push through the CRA process. It's not just about wanting to do it. It's about having the actual legislative bandwidth.
Bandwidth, right. So
yes.
It's a focused tool, not a broad axe. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. I understand that if they do successfully use the CRA to repeal a rule, it has this kind of lasting effect.
Yes. This is probably the most consequential part of the CRA. If Congress uses it to kill a regulation, the agency that issued that rule is generally barred, prohibited from issuing another rule that is substantially similar in the future.
Substantially similar. Okay.
Unless Congress specifically passes a new law authorizing them to do so.
Wow. So it's not just hitting undo. It's like hitting undo and potentially locking that function out for the future, unless Congress explicitly unlocks it again.
That's a good way to put it. It gives the CRA real teeth. It's not just about changing the present. It's about potentially blocking off certain regulatory paths for the future.
That definitely raises the stakes. Okay, so thinking back to that period, Trump's first term, where they used it 16 times, where did they focus? What kinds of regulations were the main targets?
Yeah, looking at the 115th Congress gives us some pretty clear clues. The area that saw the most CRA action, 5 regulations eliminated, was labor and employment.
Okay, labor. Like what specifically?
Well, there was an OSHA rule about how workplaces record injuries and illnesses, and also several Department of Labor rules dealing with state and local government retirement savings plans for private sector workers.
So things perceived as burdens on business, maybe?
That seems to be the common thread, yes. Easing perceived regulatory burdens in that sector.
Okay, labor and employment was number 1. What other areas saw a lot of action?
The financial sector was definitely another big one. 3 regulations got nullified there.
Financial. Which ones?
Interestingly, 2 came from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
Ah, the CFPB. Often controversial.
Right. And 1 from the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC rule is about disclosures for resource extraction companies, something from the Dodd-Frank Act.
And the CFPB ones?
1 was a rule about arbitration agreements, preventing class action lawsuits in some cases. The other was actually an agency bulletin, not even a full rule, about indirect auto lending.
And are they still looking at the CFPB now?
Seems like it. We've recently seen CRA resolutions targeting the CFPB's rule on overdraft fees. And there's been talk about another rule on using medical debt information for credit decisions.
So continued focus there. You mentioned independent agencies like CFPB and SEC. Is there something specific about them?
Yeah, it highlights a broader debate. These independent agencies, their rules generally aren't reviewed by the White House Budget Office, OIRA, for cost-benefit analysis like executive agency rules are. Some see that as a loophole. We can circle back to it.
Okay, good point. So labor, finance, what else?
Yeah.
Environment.
Yes, environment and natural resources. That was another significant area. 3 Department of the Interior regulations were overturned using the CRA.
What kind of interior rules?
There was the Stream Protection Rule, which dealt with coal mining impacts on streams, another on how federal lands are managed, resource management planning, and 1 about predator control and wildlife management in Alaska's national refuges.
So resource use, environmental protection. Those classic tension points.
Pretty much. And looking forward, people are talking about EPA rules as potential targets. Things like methane emissions from oil and gas.
Right, we've heard about that one.
And also regulations about replacing lead pipes in drinking water systems. Those could be on the list.
Okay. And any other major areas from that first wave?
Just 1 more category that saw multiple hits. Education. 2 Department of Education regulations were disapproved.
Education. What were they about?
1 related to implementing the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind. The other dealt with data collection requirements for teacher training programs.
Interesting. So labor, finance, environment, education. Seems like a pattern of targeting areas with significant regulatory activity or policy disagreements.
That seems fair to say, based on the track record.
Now let's go back to that phrase you mentioned, substantially similar. If a rule gets overturned, the agency can't issue one that's substantially similar without new permission from Congress. That sounds tricky. How do they even define that?
That is the million-dollar question, legally speaking, because the CRA itself, it doesn't define substantially the same or substantially similar.
It doesn't at all.
Nope. Left completely undefined. And as you can imagine, that creates a lot of ambiguity. It really opens the door for, well, legal fights and different interpretations.
I bet. It sounds like there's no easy checklist for an agency to say, okay, we changed X, Y, and Z, so now it's different enough.
Not even close. In fact, legal scholars have kicked around, I think, at least 7 different ways you could interpret what substantially the same might mean.
7? Wow. What's the range there?
Oh, it goes all the way from very narrow views like maybe an identical rule is okay if the outside world has changed enough to really broad interpretations that basically say Congress has occupied the field and the agency can't regulate in that area at all without new legislation.
That's a huge difference. A field day for lawyers, as they say.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of consensus view emerging, or one interpretation that seems more likely?
Well, one approach that gets talked about a lot and seems generally plausible focuses on cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, cost-benefit. How would that work?
The idea is if the agency tries to issue a new rule, and they can show it has significantly greater benefits or significantly lower costs than the rule Congress vetoed.
Or both.
Or both, right? Then maybe they can argue it's not substantially the same. It's fundamentally different in its impact.
Okay, that makes a kind of intuitive sense. It's not just tinkering. It's demonstrating a real difference in the outcome.
Exactly. But even if courts go down that path, they'd probably still give the agency some leeway, some deference on how they did the cost-benefit math.
Leeway, but not total freedom.
Right. The standard would likely be what's called arbitrary and capricious review. Basically, did the agency make a reasonable decision based on the evidence? It's not the court redoing the analysis itself.
Okay.
And importantly, this probably wouldn't involve the kind of deep deference courts sometimes give agencies on interpreting their own statutes, the so-called Chevron deference. Here, the court itself would be deciding what substantially the same means under the CRA.
So they check the agency's work on the costs and benefits, but they decide the meaning of the CRA language themselves. That's a key distinction.
It is.
Are there times when using a cost-benefit test just wouldn't make sense for this substantially similar question?
Yeah, definitely. Imagine a situation where the agency's original law, the statute Congress passed years ago, explicitly forbids them from considering costs when they write certain rules.
Okay, like some health or safety standards.
Potentially, yes. In a case like that, using a cost-benefit test to see if a new rule is substantially the same wouldn't fit. It wouldn't be relevant.
So what would they do then?
Well, maybe a less strict interpretation, perhaps focusing on whether the agency directly addressed whatever specific problems Congress had with the original rule.
But that could be hard too, right? Does Congress usually spell out its exact reasons when it uses the CRA?
Rarely. That's the problem. They usually just vote yes or no on the resolution of disapproval, so figuring out the specific congressional objection can be difficult.
It sounds like navigating this substantially the same clause is just inherently messy and likely to end up in court a lot.
That seems like a very safe bet, yes.
Okay. Shifting gears just a bit, we've talked about what might happen, but we're already seeing some moves, right? Republicans pushing back on Biden's regulations even now.
Absolutely. Just this past April 2024, we saw Republican lawmakers in both the House and Senate introduce bills specifically designed to overturn new EPA regulations.
The methane ones you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The ones targeting methane and other pollutants from the oil and gas industry.
And what's their argument for trying to block those?
The main arguments cited were that the rules are, overly burdensome on the industry and that they'd lead to higher energy prices for consumers.
So familiar arguments in these debates.
Very familiar. But the action itself, introducing those bills, it really signals the ongoing intent to use whatever legislative tools are available, potentially including the CRA later on, to roll back parts of the Biden environmental agenda. Those rules are clearly already in their sights.
The first shots are already being fired, essentially. Okay, one last area I wanted to explore touches on something you mentioned earlier, this idea about independent agencies and OIRA review. What's the debate there?
Right. This is a pretty central piece of the regulatory reform discussion, especially among conservatives. OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
Part of the White House Budget Office.
Correct. It plays this gatekeeper role, reviewing the costs and benefits of major regulations from executive branch agencies like EPA or the Department of Labor.
But not from independent agencies.
Generally, no. Agencies like the CFPB, the SEC, the FCC, they're structured to be more independent from direct presidential control, and their rules typically bypass that OIRA review process.
And why do some people have a problem with that?
Well, groups like the Heritage Foundation, for example, argue this is a big gaping loophole, as they put it.
Loophole.
Their view is that without that White House OIRA check, these independent agencies can issue burdensome regulations without enough scrutiny of the economic impact. They argue that subjecting these agencies' major rules to OIRA cost-benefit review is essential for regulatory common sense.
And how could that even happen? Would Congress have to pass a law?
Well, some argue the president might be able to do it through an executive order.
Really? Based on what?
Based on the president's constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The argument is that overseeing the regulatory output of all federal agencies, even independent ones, falls under that umbrella.
So the idea is these agencies aren't totally separate, and the president should still have some oversight on the costs of their major rules.
That's the core of the argument from that perspective, yes, that the current lack of OIRA review, or sometimes even a requirement for rigorous cost-benefit analysis internally within those agencies, needs to be fixed for better accountability.
Okay, fascinating. We have covered a lot of ground here. Let's try to pull together the main threads, the key takeaways, especially thinking about the CRA and a potential second Trump term.
Sure. I think the essential points are, first, the CRA is a uniquely powerful tool. It allows for rapid overturning of recent rules when you get that specific political alignment, a change in the White House and the new president's party controlling Congress.
Right. Power tool, specific conditions.
Second, based on past use and current signals, financial and environmental regulations seem like prime targets, especially rules coming out of those independent agencies like the CFPB, which are often a focus of deregulation efforts.
Okay, finance and environment, especially independent agencies.
And third, the substantially the same clause is a huge wildcard. It adds a major layer of legal complexity and uncertainty. While a cost-benefit test seems like a likely approach for courts, it's not guaranteed, and it's definitely going to lead to litigation.
Legal complexity and the shadow of future limits. Got it. So, for you, the listener, why does all this wonky legislative stuff matter? What's the real-world significance here?
Well, because these potential shifts in regulations aren't just abstract. They could have very real, tangible effects on things that impact daily life.
Like what?
Like rules around your bank accounts, credit cards, auto loans, that's the consumer finance piece, or rules affecting air and water quality, energy production. That's the environmental side. Understanding the CRA gives you a framework, a lens for anticipating where changes might be coming and what the policy battles might look like.
So it helps you see around the corner a bit, potentially.
Okay.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe a final thought for everyone to chew on. Given this power of the CRA, not just to erase a rule, but to potentially block agencies from acting again in that space, how might that change the whole game? How might it reshape how both the White House and Congress even think about making policy in the first place? Is it a necessary check on agencies, ensuring they don't overstep? Or does it inject too much instability, making long-term planning almost impossible when rules can be wiped out and future action blocked so easily after an election?
That's a really fundamental question about the balance of power and regulatory stability.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Right.
We really encourage you to look into some of the specific regulations we touched on today and follow the political and legal twists and turns around the Congressional Review Act as things develop.